Hey everybody. Um, Continuing into week 6 of this class, it's another interesting week, and it's another week that I look forward to doing studies on and just kind of learning more. Paul isn't my favorite Bible character, but he is definitely one of the Bible characters that I've studied the most, and I think that's just because his work is still so relevant. Um, every time I read a work of Paul, I seem to pull something that I see is still very relevant in either today's society, for myself, or even for the church as a whole. I think his work will be everlasting in that way. That we'll always be able to look back on his works and find something to either help improve the health of the church, or just looking back on stories, on teaching, and whatever we find in Paul, just the way he taught people. Like we can always go back to his works, and I think find something that will help us in today's society, even though it is such a old teaching, but it's still so relevant today. Um, but going into this discussion question specifically, I was pretty excited. I love the book of Romans. Again, I don't think it's one of my favorite Bible books in the Bible, but I have studied it a little bit, and it's always been interesting to myself. Um, but looking at this idea of Paul explaining human sinfulness, it's cool because Paul takes us back to Genesis in chapters 1, and he is explaining to us that, like, all the nations that we find in Genesis and the story of Genesis were all trapped in sin. Um, and he even goes on and continues to talk about these stories that we find in Genesis, and he talks about the Israelites and how they are all trapped in sin, even though they had the Torah, the book, the law that they were trying to quote unquote follow. And the stories that we read, they don't do a very good job of following this, and they're trapped in sin. They're trapped in idolatry. They're trapped in these numerous amounts of sins that keep bouncing them back, and which eventually lead them to be banished from the promised land for 40 years, and they go through that whole um, journey in the wilderness of how they've been banished, and it takes a journey that should only take a year, maybe, is taking 40 years now because of their sin and how they're trapped in that. And Paul takes that, and he takes those stories that we find in Genesis, and he puts them into the book of Romans and into his teachings. And I love this because I am an Old Testament nerd. I love the Old Testament. So whenever I see the New Testament pointing back to the Old Testament, it's one of my favorite things. And I think that's why I really like Paul. But he makes this point to say that Israel's trapped in sin and the nations are trapped in sins that we see in Genesis, and he makes this point to say that we are still trapped in sin. Um, and the cool thing about this point is he says we're still trapped in sin, but because of the gospel, because of Jesus, we have been released from that sin. Because of the cross, Jesus came, died for us, and we have been released from these chains that we call that are sin. Um, and I was watching, I use the Bible Project a lot to kind of study up on just overviews of books. And I was watching the Bible Project on Romans, the first part, and it has a quote in here. And I kind of Googled the quote to see if it was from anywhere else, and I couldn't find anything. But I think it's just so good. It says, Jesus became what we are, so we could become. Sorry, excuse me. Jesus became what we are, so we could become what he is. Um, and I think it's so simple, but it's just so true. Jesus came down to this earth, became a human. He was God. God as a human came to this earth, went and died on the cross for our sins so that we can strive to become what he has become. And I think this is Paul maintaining the dignity of the human race in this question. This is Paul breaking everything down, breaking us down, the despair that we are as humans, this natural act that we want to sin and we want to go out, and it just naturally happens. But we also have this hope that Jesus provided for us by dying on the cross, and that we can become holy and we can become sanctified. And I think it's just this really cool imagery that Paul puts in our head, and he takes us all the way back to Genesis and the first books that we read in the Bible, and we see that the people are doing the exact same thing as the people in the book of Romans, that we're still trapped in the sins. And then again, like I was saying, Paul's work still is so relevant to this society that we're doing the exact same things that the people and the people in the book of Romans were doing, and that the people in Genesis were doing. And it's just kind of continuous cycle. But the awesome thing, and the thing that the people in Genesis that we read about didn't have, is they didn't have Jesus. Jesus didn't come and fulfill the law yet, and that is the blessing. That is kind of our hope, that Jesus came as a human and died on the cross for us. So I think that's kind of like what I pulled from this question, looking specifically in Romans, and just how humans are so sinful and naturally sinful, but yet we still have this hope because of Jesus. Like I said, I'm excited to keep studying um, Paul's works as we go through, and it's just super cool that we can still read his works and we can pull things that will always apply today. And I think that's true for the whole Bible, but specifically for Paul. So yeah, those are my thoughts.